I told him real men would fight for me. He said, I'm not a war worth fighting, and filed for divorce. Can you believe that after everything I've done for him, all the emotional labor, all the times I tried to help him become a better person, and this is how he repays me? By abandoning me when I needed him most? Looking back now, I can see exactly when Jimmy started changing into this cold, emotionless robot. We'd been married 6 years, and honestly, things had been rough. For a while, I mean, marriages work, right? Everyone says that. And I was doing the work. I was the one trying to communicate, trying to get him to open up, trying to make our relationship better. But Jimmy, he just shut down more and more. The man I married used to have passion. He used to care about things, get fired up about stuff. Sure, his job as some kind of safety inspector for fireworks displays was weird, but at least he used to talk about it. He'd come home with these crazy stories about drunk people doing stupid things rather than explosives, and we'd laugh together. I used to make him banana bread just because, back when I thought small gestures mattered to him, back when I thought he noticed anything I did. But somewhere along the way, Jimmy became this hollow shell of a person. He'd come home from work and just exist, like he was going through the motions of being a husband without actually being present. Do you know how exhausting it is to be married to someone who's physically there but emotionally checked out? It's like talking to a wall, except walls don't give you judgmental looks when you're trying to express your feelings. I tried everything to connect with him. I'd share my day, tell him about the interesting people I met at Pilates, ask him questions about his work, but he'd just grunt responses or give me these one word answers like I was bothering him. So, yeah, sometimes my voice would get a little sharp. Sometimes I'd get frustrated when he'd fold the towels wrong after I'd specifically shown him the right way multiple times. Is it really so much to ask for someone to pay attention to details that matter to you? And don't even get me started on how he'd dismiss my hobbies and interests. I'm naturally empathetic. I can read people's energy, understand what they're really feeling, even when they're trying to hide it. It's a gift, honestly. But Jimmy would roll his eyes whenever I try to explain someone's behavior or help him understand the emotional subtext of situations. He'd act like I was being dramatic when I was just being insightful. The worst part was how he'd just sit there with this blank expression when I was trying to have important conversations about our relationship. I'd be pouring my heart out, explaining how his behavior was affecting me, how we could improve things, and he'd stare at me like I was speaking a foreign language. Sometimes I'd have to raise my voice just to get any kind of reaction out of him. At least when I got emotional, I knew he was actually listening instead of mentally checking out. Then he started this whole weird phase with ancient philosophy books like Marcus Aurelius, this Epictetus, that suddenly he's walking around the house like some enlightened monk, speaking in these measured tones and giving me these infuriating non responses to everything. When I'd try to discuss a problem, he'd say things like, I see where you're coming from, without actually engaging with what I was saying. I was like, talking to a customer service representative instead of my husband. I knew something was seriously wrong when he stopped reacting to anything. Normal couples fight. It's healthy. It means you're both invested in the relationship. But Jimmy started responding to everything with this creepy calm that made my skin crawl. I'd be upset about something legitimate, and he'd just nod and say he understood, then walk away. That's not understanding, that's dismissal, that's emotional abandonment. The philosophy thing was clearly his way of avoiding dealing with our real problems. Instead of working on himself or our marriage, he was hiding behind these dead Roman guys and their outdated ideas about emotions. He started journaling, which would have been great if he was actually processing his feelings, but I could tell he was just using it to further detach from me. He'd write in that stupid notebook every morning like he was documenting evidence or something. I started feeling like I was married to a stranger, this man who used to laugh at my jokes, who used to get excited about things, who used to show actual human emotions, had turned into this robotic version of himself. And when I'd try to point this out, he'd use his therapy speak on me. I hear you, he'd say, or that must be frustrating for you. Like I was some patient he was managing instead of his wife. Meanwhile, I was drowning. I felt so alone in my own marriage. Here I was trying to save our relationship, trying to get him to engage with me on any meaningful level. And he was more interested in his ancient books than in his living, breathing wife who was right in front of him. I started spending more time at Pilates because at least there people actually listened when I spoke. People appreciated my insights and my energy. That's where I met Colin. And before you judge me, you need to understand what my life had become. I was living with someone who treated me like a roommate at best, an annoyance at worst. Colin was everything. Jimmy wasn't passionate, emotionally available, present. When I talked, he actually listened. When I shared my thoughts, he didn't dismiss them or try to manage me with some philosophical. Colin saw me, really saw me. He appreciated my depth, my emotional intelligence, my ability to connect with people. He didn't make me feel crazy for having feelings or wanting my partner to actually participate in our relationship. With Colin, I remembered what it felt like to be valued, to be desired, to be treated like I mattered. I'm not proud of how things developed, but I'm also not going to pretend I didn't deserve to feel appreciated. Jimmy had emotionally abandoned our marriage long before I found comfort elsewhere. He created the void that Colin filled. If Jimmy had been present, if he had been the husband I needed, none of this would have happened. The texting with Colin started innocently enough. We'd talk about class, about life, about dreams and goals. He made me laugh in a way I hadn't laughed in months. He'd send me little messages throughout the day that would make me smile, something Jimmy hadn't done in years. Yes, I told Colin he made me feel alive because he did. When you've been emotionally starved for so long, genuine attention feels like sunlight. I was careful about it. I wasn't stupid. I knew Jimmy would overreact if he found out I was getting my emotional needs met by someone else, even though he was the one who'd created the situation by being emotionally unavailable. I'd delete messages, be discreet about when I'd respond. I was protecting both of us from his inevitable dramatic reaction. But Jimmy, in his new creepy, calm persona, had apparently turned into some kind of detective. He went through my phone, my Uber history, my private messages. The violation of my privacy was unbelievable. Instead of looking at his own behavior and asking why his wife might need to find connection elsewhere, he decided to spy on me like I was some kind of criminal. When he confronted me, I was actually relieved. Finally, I thought, we're going to have a real conversation. Finally, he's going to show some emotion about our marriage. I was prepared to explain everything, to help him understand how he'd gotten to this point, to work together on rebuilding what we'd lost. But no, he sat there making tea like we were discussing the weather. He highlighted text messages like he was preparing a legal case. When I tried to explain the emotional context, the loneliness that had driven me to seek connection elsewhere, he just nodded and said he'd be filing for divorce. Just like that, 6 years of marriage, and he's ready to throw it all away without even trying to fight for us. That's when I said it, that real men would fight for their wives, because they do. When you love someone, when you're committed to someone, you don't just give up at the first sign of trouble. You fight for your relationship. You try to understand what went wrong and how to fix it. You don't just coldly announce you're filing papers like you're canceling a subscription. And his response, you're not a war worth fighting. Can you imagine 6 years of marriage and I'm not worth fighting for? The woman who supported him, who tried to help him grow, who put up with his emotional unavailability and his weird philosophical phase. I'm not worth the effort. That's when I knew I was dealing with someone who had completely lost touch with his humanity. The Jimmy I marry would never have said something so cruel. That Jimmy had a heart, had feelings, cared about hurting people he loved. This new version was like a sociopath wearing my husband's face. I tried everything to reach the real Jimmy. I got dressed up, reminded him of better times, tried to reconnect physically and emotionally, but he responded to everything like a robot. Thanks for your input. He'd say like I was some stranger making a suggestion instead of his wife trying to save their marriage. It was inhuman. When I called, his parents, I thought maybe they could help him see reason. They'd always loved me, always thought I was good for Jimmy. His mother used to tell people how grounded and wise I was, how lucky Jimmy was to have found someone so emotionally intelligent. But Jimmy had gotten to them first with his version of events, painting me as some kind of villain while positioning himself as the long-suffering victim. His mother actually asked if I was okay, like I was the one with the problem. I tried to explain what Jimmy had become, how he'd turned into this emotionally dead person who stared at walls and spoke like a robot. But they believed his story about philosophy and self improvement. They couldn't see that their son had lost his humanity in pursuit of some twisted idea of emotional control. Even his father, who I thought might understand the importance of fighting for your marriage, sided with Jimmy. When I explained that Jimmy had given up without even trying to work things out, his dad actually seemed proud of Jimmy's handling of the situation. Like destroying your marriage with cold indifference was something to celebrate. The divorce papers came so fast it made my head spin. While I was still trying to process what was happening to our marriage, Jimmy had already moved on to treating me like a legal obstacle to overcome. No counseling, no real conversation about what had gone wrong, no attempt to understand each other's perspectives, just papers and lawyer. And the complete dismantling of our life together. Meanwhile, Colin was dealing with his own drama. Apparently, the Pilates studio had some ridiculous policy about instructors and clients, and he got fired for ethical concerns. Like two adults connecting on a deep level is somehow unethical. The whole thing was blown out of proportion by people who couldn't understand that real connection doesn't follow arbitrary rules. Colin tried to explain that he wasn't ready for the intensity of our situation, which I understood. Going from private messages to potentially being part of a divorce was a lot to handle. I didn't blame him for needing space to process everything, but the timing was terrible. Losing my marriage and my closest friend in this same period was devastating. I posted some photos during this time, just trying to remind myself that I was still a whole person outside of my failed marriage. The captions were about healing and growth because that's what I was trying to do. But people love to judge a woman who's going through a difficult time. If you show any sign of moving forward, you're attention seeking. If you stay hidden, you're pathetic. You can't win. Jimmy, meanwhile, seemed to be thriving on the destruction of our marriage. Mutual friends said he was working out, meal prepping, acting like divorcing his wife was the best thing that ever happened to him. The man who'd been emotionally dead for months suddenly had energy for everything except trying to save his marriage. It was like he'd been waiting for an excuse to abandon our relationship, and I'd finally given him one. His whole family bought into his narrative about finding peace and inner strength. His dad actually laughed when Jimmy told him I'd accused him of being in a cult, like my legitimate concerns about his personality change were some kind of joke. They couldn't see that their son had traded his humanity for this fake sense of superiority. I tried dating again after a few months because you have to move forward. I met a therapist, an actual licensed therapist, not some life coach, and thought maybe he'd understand the complexity of what I'd been through. Someone with training in human psychology would surely see that Jimmy's behavior had been emotionally abusive, that his cold detachment had created the problems in our marriage, but even he couldn't handle the reality of what I'd experienced. After 3 months of dating, he said I needed to reflect on how I process criticism. Like I was the problem. Like wanting your partner to show basic human emotion and fight for your relationship was somehow unreasonable. He broke up with me in this condescending way, like he was doing me a favor by pointing out my supposed flaws. I made a TikTok about it because honestly, the whole experience was surreal. Here was someone whose job was literally to help people work through relationship issues, and he couldn't handle dating someone who'd been through actual relationship trauma. I was processing my experience, trying to heal, and he wanted me to pretend everything was fine and never talk about what had happened to me. Or months after the divorce was final, I sent Jimmy one text, just one. I said he'd never given me closure because he hadn't. He destroyed our marriage without any real explanation, without any attempt to work things out, without any acknowledgement of his role in creating our problems. All I got was his cold announcement and legal papers. He didn't even respond, left me unread like I was some random person instead of someone he'd shared 6 years of his life with. That's the level of cruelty I was dealing with, a man who couldn't even be bothered to acknowledge his ex-wife's need for basic human decency. People keep asking me if I regret anything, if I've learned from this experience, if I can see Jimmy's perspective now, but honestly, I regret wasting 6 years trying to save a marriage with someone who is incapable of real emotional connection. I regret not seeing sooner that Jimmy had fundamental problems with intimacy and vulnerability that no amount of love or patience on my part could fix. Jimmy turned our marriage into a war by emotionally abandoning me and then acted like I was the aggressor when I tried to fight for us. He created the problems, forced me to seek connection elsewhere, then used my completely understandable response as justification for his predetermined decision to give up on our relationship. I am not the villain in the story, no matter how Jimmy and his family wants to paint it. I'm someone who tried everything to save a marriage with a man who'd already checked out. I'm someone who sought emotional connection when it was denied at home. I'm someone who begged her husband to fight for their relationship instead of just walking away. Jimmy can have his philosophy books and his fake peace. He can pretend that destroying a marriage makes him enlightened, but I know the truth. He was a coward who ran away from the hard work of actually being married. Real men fight for their wives. Real men try to understand and grow and work through problems together. I deserved better than what Jimmy gave me. I deserved a husband who saw me as worth fighting for, who valued our relationship enough to try saving it, who cared more about his wife's feelings than about maintaining his precious emotional detachment. And someday I'll find someone who understands that love requires effort, vulnerability, and the willingness to fight for each other when things get difficult. Jimmy made himself fireproof, but he also made himself incapable of real love. That's not strength, that's emotional cowardice, and I refuse to let him or anyone else make me feel guilty for expecting more from my marriage than cold indifference and philosophical platitudes. The real tragedy is that Jimmy will probably never understand what he lost. He'll go through life thinking he handled our divorce with wisdom and maturity, never realizing that he threw away a woman who loved him enough to fight for their relationship even when he wouldn't fight for her. His loss. Honestly, I know my worth and I know I deserve better than what he gave